currently Earth. On June 18th in 1778, after almost 9 months of occupation, 15,000 British troops under the command of General Sir Henry Clinton evacuate Philadelphia, our nation's former capital. The Brits had captured Philadelphia on September 26, 1777, following General George Washington's defeat at the Battle of Brandywine and the Battle of the Clouds. British General William Howe had made Philadelphia the seat of the Continental Congress, the focus of his campaign, but the Patriot government had deprived him of the decisive victory he hoped for by moving its operations to the more secure site of York 1 week before the city was taken. While Howe and British officer corps spent the winter enjoying the luxury of Philadelphia's finest homes, the Continental Army froze and suffered appalling deprivation at Valley Forge. Fortunately for the Patriots, an infusion of capable European strategists, including the Prussian Baron von Steuben. From the French side, Marquis de Lafayette and the Baron of Kalb, Johann. From the Polish side, Tadeusz Kościuszko and Kazimierz Pulaski all aided Washington in the creation of a well-drilled professional force capable of fighting the British. The British position in Philadelphia became untenable after France's entrance into the war on the side of the Americans. To avoid the French fleet, General Clinton was forced to lead his British Hessian force to New York City by land. Loyalists in the city sailed down the Delaware River to escape the Patriots, who returned to Philadelphia the day after the British departure. U.S. General Benedict Arnold, who led the force that reclaimed the city without bloodshed, was appointed military governor. On June 24th, the Continental Congress returned to the city from its temporary quarters at York, Pennsylvania. On June 18th in 1798, President John Adams oversaw the passage of the Naturalization Act, the first of 4 pieces of controversial legislation known together as the Alien and Sedition Acts. At this time in our history, we were actually threatened by a war with France, and Congress was attempting to pass laws that would give more authority to the federal government, and the president in particular, to deal with the suspicious persons, especially foreign nationals. The Naturalization Act raised the requirements for aliens to apply for U.S. citizenship, requiring that immigrants reside in the U.S. for 14 years before becoming eligible. The earlier law had required only 5 years of residence before an application could be made. Our second president, John Adams, in fact, never enforced the Naturalization Act. Nevertheless, he came under heavy fire from opponents. Led by Vice President Thomas Jefferson, who felt that the Naturalization Act and its companion legislation was unconstitutional and smacked of despotism. Vice President Jefferson was so disgusted with President Adams' enthusiastic support of the law that he could no longer support the president and left Washington during the congressional vote. Now, former President George Washington supported this legislation to keep our nation safe. President Adams signed the second piece of legislation, the Alien Act, on June 25th. This act gave the president authority to deport aliens during peacetime. The Alien Enemies Act, which Adams signed on July 6th, gave him the power to deport any alien living in the U.S. with ties to U.S. wartime enemies. Finally, the Sedition Act, passed on July 14th, gave Adams tremendous power to define treasonable activity, including any false, scandalous, and malicious writing. The intended targets of the Sedition Act were newspapers, pamphlets, and broadside publishers who printed what he considered to be libelous articles aimed primarily at his administration. Abigail Adams urged her husband to pass the Sedition Act, calling his opponents criminal and vile. Of the four acts, the Sedition Act was the most distressing to staunch First Amendment advocates. They objected to the fact that treasonable activity was vaguely defined, was defined at the discretion of the president, and would be punished by heavy fines and imprisonment. The arrest and imprisonment of 25 men for supposedly violating the Sedition Act ignited an enormous outcry against the legislation. Citing what was considered to be President Adams' abuse of presidential powers and threats to free speech, Jefferson's party took control of Congress and the presidency in 1800. On June 18th in 1812, what is known as the War of 1812 began. The day after, the Senate followed the House of Representatives in voting to declare war against Great Britain. Our fourth president, James Madison, signed the war declaration into law. A sizable number of our Congress didn't agree with the war. However, war was imminent. American seamen were being forced into the British Royal Navy against their will if they were caught outside of U.S. waters. The British were supporting native tribes along the Great Lakes frontier, and there was a blockade. The British economic blockade of France was hurting our nation economically. Feel the power. War ensued and later engendered the boundary of the United States and Canada. On June 18, 1983, Dr. Sally K. Ride becomes the first American woman to travel into space. Sally Christian Ride spent her time amongst us on this planet as an American astronaut and physicist. She was born in Los Angeles and she joined NASA in 1978. She was born on May 26, 1951. Sally Ride was the third woman in space overall, after USSR cosmonauts Valentina Tereshkova and Svetlana Savitskaya. Rye remains the youngest American astronaut to have traveled to space, having done so at the age of 32. After flying twice on the Orbiter Challenger, she left NASA in 1987. Rye worked for 2 years at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Arms Control, then at the University of California, San Diego, primarily researching nonlinear optics and Thomson scattering. She served on the committees that investigated the Challenger and Columbia Space Shuttle disasters, the only person to participate in both. Having been married to astronaut Steve Hawley during her spaceflight years, and in a private long-term relationship with former Women's Tennis Association player Tam O'Shaughnessy in her years after, she is the earliest space traveler to have been recognized as LGBT. Rye continued her eternity on July 23, 2012. Today, we remember her awesomeness. All information documented on this audio file can be verified on wikipedia.org and history.com.